So I'm sitting here on this rainy day, looking to introduce week 3 of the class, and I'm trying to take a more real and casual approach to this introduction because, honestly, this is such an important week in the class. And I say that because you spent the last 2 weeks sort of being introduced to literally a fire hose of information about science and research in general. And I said literal, but obviously it wasn't literal. It was, well, it was metaphorical. But it was a lot of information. And one of the most important things that I want to impress upon you as we enter into week 3 is that the information and the ideas that have been presented are really, really important. I had a student who asked me, or rather told me, that one of the reasons why they were struggling over the last couple of weeks is that everything seems so irrelevant to what they do in their class day to day. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciated that perspective and that input, because it reminded me to remind you that what you're invested in right now in this class are ideas that sort of transcend like what it means to be teaching in the day-to-day, but it doesn't transcend at all what it means to be a professional educator and what it means to think like a professional. And so here we are in week 3, and it's kind of an awkward week because on the one hand you're going to be learning about interpretivist research models, but you just finished learning about positivist research models. So this week I'm asking you to design the positivist aspect of your mixed method research proposal. And yet the information and examples and outcomes for this week deal with the next type, or a different type, interpretivist. Now, I did this because we're sort of stuck in a 5-week model, and I couldn't ask you to design part of your research project if you hadn't already really studied and learn more about the methodologies that I'm asking you to think about and design. So we just finished that, and you had information, examples, even an exam over those models, and now I'm asking you to apply it to your project design. But then here we are in week 3, and I'm asking you to think about and learn about and consider a different approach. And it's an approach that is important, interpretivist, because you're dealing with humans. Your variables relate to human behaviors, learning about, thinking, how all of that translates into helping people learn, and how learning can be translated into changing how people behave. And by behaviors, I mean things that they can do. So learning is about things that people learn how to do. And so it's about human behaviors and changing human behaviors. And what that means is that common positivist models of research may not always be the best approach when you're trying to study and investigate what you can do to help people learn things. So the interpretivist approach is really important, and that's what this week is really all about. But before you step forward with week 3, I really do want you to take a moment to consider how important it is to have a scientific way of thinking as you consider educational claims. Many of you reflected from the readings about how powerful it was for you to learn a little bit more about the idea of learning styles, and how the author of the book that we're reading came right out and said in the very beginning of the book that learning styles don't exist, that is kind of a myth. And he proceeded to lay out some scientific evidence to support his conclusion that learning styles, or should I say at least teaching to learning styles, is sort of a fool's errand. And I kind of wanted to revisit that a little bit, because I really appreciated all of the reflections that many students in the class had about learning more about how learning styles, or at least what you learned about learning styles, might have been a little bit misguided and not well informed. And I guess one of the things that I want to underscore in Willingham's message about that is that he was really talking more about what you can do about learning styles and not learning styles themselves. So let me say a little bit more about that. One of the things about learning styles that you tend to learn, and that I certainly learned as an educator, is that students might be kinesthetic learners, or they might be audio learners, or they might be visual learners. So using their emphasizing hearing information, or seeing information and processing it, or feeling information, or doing something kinesthetically, or with tactile input, aids in the learning process. And there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that model has any connection to reality. I mean, the very idea of sort of reducing styles to 3 fundamental types, if you think about it long enough, it doesn't actually make sense. But the reality is, if you want to take learning styles as sort of an idea, if you teach a classroom full of 25 students, you likely have 25 different learning styles out there. I mean, everybody has their own preferences for things that help them accomplish learning goals the best way for them. And everybody has different qualities and different attributes that might favor various modalities. And that's something that Willingham did speak to. That is, certain people process visual information in a way that might aid them in helping to learn various things through visual channels. So the same might go for audio channels. But really what we're talking about is how can you help somebody best learn a skill, a particular skill. And what Willingham was saying in talking about learning styles is that there may be a spectrum of learning styles, like there are a spectrum of everything else related to humans and human behavior. But helping somebody learn something, what is best to help somebody learn something, depends on what you want them to learn how to do. And if you want them to learn how to do something that depends on visual channels, then obviously you're going to need to provide information and examples that emphasize the application of the skill to the learning to the learning outcome that is about the visual channel. So just on a very simplified note, if you wanted somebody to be able to identify a particular species of bird based on their structure, not based on the sound that they make in the wild, but based on their structure, what they look like, their coloring, their size, that would require some visual information. So the examples would need to be visual in that case. And that's really what Willingham was suggesting, that if somebody labels you an auditory learner, that's not going to help you learn how to identify birds from their visual structure. you're going to need good visual information and examples and good feedback in that regard. And so it doesn't matter what style you have. What matters is how well the instruction is created and produced. And that is so important. That's such an important perspective to hold as an educator, because you as an educator can only do something about what's external to learners. You really can't do anything about individual learning styles from inside their brains. You can only try to develop experiences, present information, provide feedback, all of that based on what's external to the learner. And that is and the best way to do that is to look at the research and the literature on how to best help people learn. And that has nothing to do with learning styles. That has to do with instructional design, and that's a whole different thing. So that's kind of what Willingham was communicating. I think he was using shocking language to say, hey, learning styles are a myth. But why is this so important now? You know, we all faced a profound episode during COVID of a society that in many ways really lost confidence in science. And I say this because there were popular sources of news and information that were circulating during COVID that tried to dispute or bring into question the credibility of people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, whose experiences and whose education and experiences were honestly beyond question. And yet as a public-facing figure, his words and his perspective were in some ways demonized. And what was championed by many people over science were myths and hypotheses that were easily debunked, and yet people hung on to them because there were a lot of emotions flying around. And honestly, we just witnessed people losing their minds, and it ended up having very negative consequences for the health of many people in the country and in the world. And I guess that underscores how important it is for educators to consider how to think more scientifically, so that they're operating off of a set of principles that are much more reasonable and have a much greater chance at accomplishing what teachers want to ultimately accomplish. What teachers ultimately want to accomplish, right? And that is to be able to help people learn important things. And when you study that scientifically, one thing you're going to learn when you enter into week 3 is that sometimes a positive approach is not always the most appropriate approach when you're trying to really understand a particular aspect of teaching and learning. And I know I've already said a lot about the sample that I gave you last week regarding the scientific study, the interpretivist study that was done by Thomas Barone on arts education. But that is such a profound, important example of why an interpretivist approach, at least for part of an educational investigation, can be so powerful and so meaningful. Because there are so many different ways that you can study the value of something, and in this case, the value of an arts education. But certainly one of the most important perspectives and approaches walk in the shoes of somebody who is an arts educator and who is having a profound impact on many people's lives because of his work, because of his choices, and because of what he does for the students, for the population that he is influencing as an educator. And so here we are in week 3, and I'm asking you to consider different ways to study teaching and learning that are just as scientific as a positivist approach, but you're going to take a look at different methodologies. And I know that I don't offer a huge, rich background in some of the models like ethnography that are being presented in week 3. But again, I hope you recognize and understand the value of that. And I'm asking you to apply that next week in the design of part of your study, so that not only can you have a positivist approach in considering how you might determine the impact of artificial intelligence in education, but also how you might consider the impact from the teaching and learning perspective through an interpretivist approach. So that's what you have going on in week 3. So again, like last week, you have some notes and information to study. For week 3, for part 3, you have another part of your project, and then you have a reflection that asks you to continue the process that Willingham put into play from the text on how to in this case trace the credibility of the people making the claims. And so you're going to have to do a little bit of online research to do that. But hopefully all of that is going to help lead you to a deeper understanding of the value of how to interpret existing research and that apply to existing claims, and how you might apply that to your own thinking about how you would investigate problems associated with something as interesting as AI in education. So carry on and look at the introduction to week 3. Look at all the requirements and expectations. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Contact me. Email. I'm happy to set up any phone conversations if you're struggling with anything, but it's important stuff, and I hope you appreciate this week's perspectives.